Hello readers and writers, I'm MJ and today we're doing my June and July reading wrap-up. So you may be asking yourself, June and July, well, weren't those months forever ago? And you would be right. But I was moving during those months and I was not doing very well on keeping track of everything. So I thought, especially since my book totals were kind of lower those months, let's just do one video wrapping them both up and call it a day. So in June, I actually read a total of 6 books. About a third of them were smaller, under 300 pages, and the rest of them were 300 to 499 pages. I did not read any longer books that month. Surprise, surprise. I read mostly fiction with one nonfiction book, and of those, 4 of them were science fiction, so that's kind of cool. A third of them were audiobooks, 50% were digital, and then 17% of them was print. I'm actually surprised there was even one that ended up being a print read, to be honest. So in July, this is the month we actually were physically moving. I read a total of 8 books, and probably it's a little higher because there's audiobooks while we were driving. However, they were all smaller books. 3 of them were under 300 pages, and the rest were between 300 and 499 pages. Of those, I again had one nonfiction book, and the rest were fiction. And in July, I read mostly fantasy. Only like 3 science fiction books. 63% were digital. Surprisingly, only 25% of them were audiobook, and then 1 was print, or 13%. So what did I actually read? I definitely went with some more comfort reads during this time because I was super stressed. So my first read is Wild Signs, and this is number 6 of the Alpha and Omega series by Patricia Briggs. And if you haven't started this series, then me telling you what's it like in the middle of this series, which is actually a companion series, isn't really going to be helpful. Then I read A View from the Stars by Chin Liu, and this is actually like a non-fiction essay with short stories mixed into it, and it was an interesting read. A lot of history and ideas about science fiction in China, which I haven't been exposed to before, and I really appreciated that aspect of it. And I also read Burn Bright, which is the 5th book in the Alpha and Omega series, so again, another comfort read. I did read Rake's Fall. This is an arc I got from Tor Publishing. It took me a second to actually remember what it was about, but now I remember why. It is a science fiction fantasy novel. It's probably more fantasy, honestly, that has reincarnation, and it is ultimately a journey through time, from ancient time to the vast future. It is not told in a necessarily linear Western point of view. I do appreciate the way that the story was constructed, like the idea behind the writing. I really do like that. The story itself, I thought, could have potentially been a little bit more compelling, honestly, but it was good. I enjoyed it, but it's not necessarily my most favorite science fiction novel ever, especially since it did take me a second to actually remember what it is that I had read. Then I finished my journey through Star Trek read, which is Serpent Among the Ruins. This is number 2 of the Lost Eras. I'm pretty sure I made it short about this one. It was okay, honestly. And then I listened to The Possibilities. This was heartbreaking. It has to deal with parallel worlds and mental health and kind of a juxtaposition of the two, as well as parenting. The book definitely has trigger warnings, so especially for loss of a child. So do not, if that's a trigger for you, I highly do not recommend you pick up this book. But it was very well written, very compelling idea, and it left me with a lot of thoughts. And I probably would have gone into it down a rabbit hole a little bit more when I read it, had I not been in such a mental fixated state on, moving. Alright, so that is all of June. Let's see what I read in July. So in July, I finished Space Odysseys. This is a non-fiction book that I read via audiobook about particle physics. I really enjoyed this one. It was a lot of more in-depth information of theories that I had only kind of sort of been exposed to, and particle physics is not the most engaging topic ever. In fact, if anything, it's extremely boring. So I really appreciate the author bringing in a lot of the narration about the scientists themselves into the book. Sometimes that really annoys me, but it was much needed for this book because, well, there's still a lot we don't know about particle physics, and a lot of the conclusions in this book were not conclusions. They were just like, here's a stepping stone to where we need to be. And we don't talk about that enough in science. That doesn't get the attention that it should have. And so I really appreciated there just being a book about us still exploring what there is to do with particle physics, and also showing how the field has grown itself. But it really needed those personal touches to make it engaging enough to keep reading through the more technical aspects of particle physics, because I am not a particle physicist. But I'm really glad that I picked up this book. So I was very stressed in July and put out a call to get some urban fantasy book recommendations that were not white centric, specifically because I was reading so much Patricia Briggs and that didn't seem like necessarily the best voice for me when the characters are indigenous. And someone recommended that I pick up Venko, which I did, and it is a fantastic, queer, racially diverse urban fantasy. It was everything that I could have wanted. It was about a sisterhood, included trans representation, and just kind of how we can reshape the future for the better. But it was done in a way that didn't exclude any gender. It wasn't written in a way that was exclusionary, like a book I'm currently kind of reading. And I really appreciate that more now, coming back to think about it, than I probably did at the time. But I also appreciated, like, I don't know, it kind of had a hopefulness to keep moving, keep going forward. Even though it kind of seems impossible, the little things we're doing, is it really helping? And there was a lot of that vibe. And then also, like, are we important enough to be the people to make the change? Because all the people that had come into this coven were not necessarily the most, like, the top of their field type of people. They were, you know, just kind of had inherited it. And I really appreciated that representation. I do think this is one that I'm probably going to end up actually rereading because I should. It was so well done, and I don't think, given the time that I read it, that I gave it its proper due. Then I listened to The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo, and honestly, I forgot about this book the day after we finished listening to it on audiobook, and it had my complete attention because I was driving at the time I was listening to it, and I could go back and keep trying to figure out what it is, but I've done this like 4 times, and I'm just gonna go with, you know, I respect Leigh Bardugo as an author. I like a lot of her works, but some of them are just not for me, and The Familiar was just not one that, like, stuck with me personally, but that's no disrespect to her as an author. Next, I pick up Soul Jar. This was specifically a collection of short stories with disability rep in them, and because I hadn't really specifically read a lot of disability rep for Disability Acceptance Month, and Soul Jar was fantastic. So as a collection of short stories, some of them are like super amazing and others were not quite as amazing, but none of them I didn't like. All of them were at least good, but some were so fantastic. Like, it was like you had to stop reading after that story just so you could process everything that happened in the short story. And definitely highly recommend, if you have not picked it up, you should absolutely do so. So 2024 was supposed to be the year of Ursula K. Le Guin for me. I was supposed to sit and read a lot of her books, and I am epically failing at that. However, I did read Planet of Exile, which I think is the 2nd or 3rd book in the Hamish Cycles series, and it was okay. Actually, I really didn't necessarily like it. I'm going to keep trying to move forward with them, but also, like, I'm going to keep reading Ursula K. Le Guin's books, but these earlier ones are harder for me to get through. Next, I read The Odd Wolf, which is an indie release by L.L. Graham, and this book is fantastic. It is paranormal, werewolf representation with a disability rep and neurodiverse rep, specifically ADHD, and I believe POTS syndrome, which is a type of like chronic fatigue. Don't quote me entirely on that. But the representation was spectacular. I loved the characters, the world building. It was really, really well done. And I can't wait to pick up the second book in the series. It is absolutely fantastic. And while a great read for Disability Awareness Month, you should be picking it up at any time, just as a regular. I want to say it's a romance book, but honestly it isn't, because it doesn't have a happily ever after, which is the requirements for a romance book. And it really doesn't actually have necessarily a romance in it, but there is this weird, not weird, but I'm aromantic, so for me any type of romance is weird. There's this very intriguing relationship that is going on that is not resolved within this first book, and I'm assuming will continue to be interplayed within the next books. It's kind of like when you watch a sitcom and your two main love interests can't get together in the first season, except that they always drag out so annoyingly long, and that's not the case in the book. Like, how it was handled, I felt was extremely appropriate, especially given the situation that both the characters are in, and I will be first in line to read the next book in the series. And then continuing on with my love of Star Trek, I picked up Star Trek Picard Firewall. This is a series that I'm trying to stay current with, because I'm not, it's hard to try and stay current with Star Trek. This is a kind of telling of Seven of Nine in the time between when Voyager makes it home and the time that we then re-meet her in Star Trek Picard, and kind of everything of where she is in her life, how she kind of makes that transition. There's been hints that it's been really rocky for her of a transition, and we find her in the Rangers in Star Trek Picard, and this is the story in between all of that, and it was a very fascinating read. And then the last book I read is another indie book called Bloody Spade. This is one that I had picked up as an ARC and never read it, so my apologies to the author, but finally getting around to it. This is a great YA book. Like, if you love YA kind of superhero type vibe books, then you'll really love Bloody Spear. It's not specifically superheroes, but it does have that nod. There's superpowers, there's, there are a group that's supposed to protect the world, but there's so much more that's going on in it that you can't just specifically label it like superhero. If anything, it kind of reminds me of Brandon Sanderson's YA series, Firestarter, or something like that. I may have gotten that title wrong, but kind of that vibe. So if you really like that, then I would highly recommend you pick up The Bloody Spare. The writing of it was fantastic. It was a very well done indie release. And as you can see, at the end of July, I did start trying to pick up less comfort reads and more of what I want to be reading. Alright, so that is my June and July wrap up. It wasn't anything too amazing and spectacular, but I did feel like I started transitioning back into actually being able to read for reading's sakes, as opposed to de-stressing myself from everything that's been going on in my life. So, as always, keep reading, keep writing, and until next time.